Before we jump into our video, I want to go ahead and tell you that we have a brand new LinkedIn page for VS Code. So go ahead and follow us there for some original articles, for content that you won't find on YouTube, and then some additional insights on our video. And now back to our scheduled program. I've always wanted to say that. GitHub Copilot has been out for over a year now, and while it's helped many developers speed up their workflow, there are still some very powerful features that many still aren't leveraging, at least not to its full extent. And in this video, I'm going to be highlighting several of those underrated features that can make a big difference in how you use Copilot. So let's jump in. If you already have Copilot installed, you can just skip to the next chapter. But if you don't, to get started with Copilot, the first thing you're going to need is a GitHub account. And if you don't have that, you can sign up for one here. And once you sign up, if you click on your account icon and select your Copilot, you could then sign up for Copilot right here. Once you sign up and you select Copilot, the UI will look just like this, where you have a few settings that you can configure with Copilot. The next thing is to install the extension. Within VS Code, you can go to the marketplace by clicking on this icon here and then just typing in Copilot. Now, Copilot does come with two extensions. There's the core GitHub Copilot extension, and there's the GitHub Copilot Chat. Whichever one that you choose, either way, when you install it, they're both going to be installed together. I already have it installed, so you'll see that I can just disable it if I want. But on your end, once it's installed, you'll know that you've installed it correctly because it will prompt you to log into GitHub. And after logging in, you'll see your account name here. Also on the right-hand side of the screen at the bottom, you'll see an icon for Copilot if you ever need to temporarily disable it. And on the left side, you'll have an icon for Copilot Chat. Then if you click there, you'll be ready to enter in either some commands or some questions to start interacting with Copilot. Now to get things started, if I want, I can create a simple file like an index.js file and enter in a comment. Copilot will start anticipating what it thinks you want to do. So if I type in a function that reverses a string, even before I finished it, it anticipated that I was going to do it for a string. Once I hit enter, it begins writing out the function for me. And at this point, I could accept it or navigate to see an alternative suggestion that it had. And the alternative is another comment, which is not what I want, but it is kind of nice. It's just an extra comment to show an example. But I'll go back to the first and I'll hit tab to accept the beginning of the function. And then if I like the remainder of the function, which looks fine to me, I can accept it by clicking tab, as you see here in the directions. What we just saw here was an example of ghost text. Now, another way I can request something from Copilot is by hitting Command I, or if you're on Windows, Control I, which brings up inline chat. And right from here, I can enter in a function that slugifies a string. And boom, right there, it gives me that function and I can accept it. And of course, the other way you can converse with chat is to use chat view. If I wanted to ask it a question like, what does slugify mean? And give me some examples. It makes sense to write that in the left pane here since it's going to take up a little bit more space in the response. And take a look at that. It means to convert a string into a URL-friendly format. And there are some examples. And one of the things that I like about this is some people don't mention this often, but if there are a lot of details that it's giving you, you could just have it read it out to you.
Slugify means to convert a string into a URL-friendly format, often referred to as a slug. This typically involves converting the string to lowercase, removing or...
Which is pretty cool. And on the opposite end, if I didn't want to type in a command, I can actually use this microphone here and speak my request to Copilot. Explain the first function. Pretty cool. I didn't even have to like hit send after I finished my statement. It detected that I was done with my statement, and then it just entered it and submitted it and gave me a response right away. Another thing I'd like to point out is these thumbs up. If you like the feedback, you can mention that it was helpful, or if not, mark unhelpful. And you could also try to resubmit automatically by clicking this curved arrow. But right off the bat, we've got all these little features that we could implement and tasks we could do with Copilot, and we're just getting started. Something that I think is underrated that you can do with GitHub Copilot is how you can use it to learn. As developers, we're constantly learning how to code and researching topics and subject matters, whether it be through courses, Stack Overflow, Google, blogs, or even just like bugging our expert colleagues. But with Copilot, it could eliminate a lot of this. So for example, let's go ahead and start asking Copilot some questions. And I'm going to clear my session here that I had before just by clicking this X here and here, just so we have a clean slate. But you're always welcome to just leave that there, as it keeps a history of all your requests. So let's say I am new to Python. I can literally just ask Copilot to create a step-by-step tutorial to learn Python. Feel free to include links to more additional resources if needed. I'll correct my spelling errors here, but even if I did, most likely it would be able to figure out what I'm talking about. And look at everything that it's going to give me right now. It gives me the steps that I need to know in terms of installing Python, then setting up my environment, and then writing my first Python code, covering some basic syntax, moving on to loops, functions, modules, working with files, error handling, object-oriented programming, and then additional resources for practicing projects. If I wanted to spend a day just focusing on object-oriented programming, I could ask it to give me more details on step 9, and it knows exactly what I was referring to. And there's a lot more content now specifically on object-oriented programming, encapsulation, inheritance, creating objects, etc. Now let's say we wanted to even ask it a high-level question, such as to create a bootcamp curriculum for a Python developer. Let's change that to a web developer that is new to coding and wants to be a software engineer. And the more details you could give it, the better, and include all common topics, but overall it'll be for a Python developer. So the idea here is I'm hoping that it tells me various courses that I need to take, but ultimately I do want to become a Python developer. And look at that. It breaks down a curriculum just as you would see in a boot camp. Starts it off with week 1 and 2, an introduction to programming and Python, then moves right into data structures and algorithms, which is interesting because oftentimes you'll see the boot camps mention HTML, CSS, and JavaScript first, moves into object-oriented programming after that, and then actually covers the web development basics for 7 and 8. And that would make sense to make sure you cover that right before you actually build a web application using something like Flask in weeks 9 and 10. And then there's the database and API topics, in addition to more advanced frameworks like React. That's pretty cool. Look at that. Up to the very end where you have a capstone project. And throughout all this are additional resources if you needed to look into them with links. So that's all great, but what if you're like, hey, that's nice, but I'm not really a beginner. I'm pretty advanced. I've been in the field for a while, and now I do plan to become an architect. So we could actually ask it to create a curriculum to become an architect. And ideally, it should keep in mind the context that we're within, and it'll give us additional topics that we could study in terms of becoming an architect. Now, I don't know about too many boot camps that are for architects, but there are just topics that do need to be covered that an architect would know. As a result, you'll see some overlap here, such as the programming fundamentals, but you could easily extract the content that was not mentioned in the first curriculum, starting from like right around here, system design and architecture. And then there's more advanced topics such as cloud computing and DevOps. So this is a perfect scenario to understand that it'll give you answers that makes sense, but sometimes it might give you a little bit more that's irrelevant. Like for example here, where it covers like some of the basics that was already covered from the first curriculum, like programming fundamentals. But this is a perfect scenario that you could say, okay, let me be more specific with my request and revise your question so that it just gives you content related to architecture. Now, the next thing that I want to show you is in the chat box here. If you enter in the @ you'll see a little menu pop up, and these are referred to as chat participants. So when we ask Copilot questions, it looks all throughout the internet. But if we want to filter things down to make the search more efficient, you could use these participants for specific topics. So if I know I'm going to be asking questions related to GitHub, I could select this, and then you can see here it says get answers grounded in web search, code search, but it's going to be keeping the context of GitHub while it's doing the search. Same thing for terminal. Asked how to do something in the terminal. So it's not going to look all over the internet for questions about the terminal. It's going to filter all content that's terminal related and then search through that. So in our scenario here, why don't we use the VS Code participant, and in the context of VS Code, we could ask, how can I get started with learning Rust? And it'll give you a lot of information in terms of using VS Code to get started learning Rust. And I'll break it down in steps as you see here with some examples. Now, because I use the @VS Code participant, we get this option here to search extension marketplace. Had I not used it, we wouldn't get it. And what this option lets us do is to click on it to bring us right to the extension marketplace and see all the extensions that's related to Rust that we could use. But we're gonna try to keep things very simple here and create a file ourselves. I'm new to Rust. I could just ask it a basic question such as, what file extension do Rust files use? Okay, it tells me that I need to have a file with an extension RS. So let's do that. I'm going to go ahead and create a new file here, and we will call this main.rs. I see it added in an extra R here. Let's just modify that. And if I do Command I can bring up the inline chat, and I could ask it to reverse a string, exactly what we asked earlier on when we were working with JavaScript, but now we're going to see how it's done in Rust. And that looks good, so I can go ahead and accept it. Now, we had also done an example where we slugified the code, so let me go ahead and highlight this and do Command I, and I'm going to ask it to refactor this to a module that has the function slugify string. And now it goes ahead and revises my code. It has both the reverse string and slugify functions. What's great is that now we could just, like with a very basic program, compare it with what we had in JavaScript when learning a new language. So I've showed you how you could ask some questions regarding different topics to learn, and also maybe even setting up a high-level boot camp and then demonstrating some code. But then you could be learning, but maybe not doing things like the best way. So you could actually tell Copilot, tell me about best practices to keep in mind while learning Rust. And boom, you get that type of information. And the last thing that I'd like to mention is that once you feel confident that you've learned your language, you've practiced it, in addition to conforming to best practices, you'll be ready to get a job, but you need to go through interviews. So why not ask Copilot to provide 50 relevant interview questions and answers? And look at that. I didn't even tell it exactly what type of interviews, but by taking into consideration your context and previous questions that you've asked, it's giving you all these different interview questions that you could study and practice and be ready on your way. Now, besides learning, Copilot could also be used for brainstorming engineering strategies, for offering suggestions and fresh ideas, for building solutions and features just to get you started. But what you need to do is give it context. Let's talk about how we could use Copilot to help you brainstorm what you need to do architecturally or programmatically. You can do this by giving it context. That's information that it needs in order to give you better, more accurate suggestions for brainstorming. And there's several ways that you could pass it context. If we hit the pound sign here, you see that you could do it by pointing it to your code base, your editor, maybe it's a specific file or selection that you have, in addition to several other. And there's also shortcuts to files that you could point to directly. Over here, I have a file called spec.md, and this is a summary of an application that I'd want to build. It's a music inventory app that's going to be using Express.js, Node, SQLite, along with the SQLese ORM, an object relational mapper. And it indicates that our goal is to create an API, a web API, that's going to be exposing data, particularly artists, albums, playlists, and has a specification regarding the page count and the ability to search for an album by name and some other details. So this is a nice human readable document. The other file that I have is a SQL file that could be used to create table and other SQL commands. Both of these can be passed as context to Copilot. So let's go ahead and demonstrate one. I could ask Copilot to use and I'll hit the pound sign and point right to my spec file and tell it to go over the architectural choices that I made to build this app and just to keep things simple. And within a few seconds, it starts the process, and you could see that it gives us in a step-by-step fashion what we need to do in terms of the backend framework, the database, an ORM, endpoints, even talks about using source control and the overall project structure, and even has a visual representation of the project structure itself. And following that is some steps to implement it, starting with initializing the project. So this is cool. And as I mentioned before, no matter what results it gives you, you can massage the results by rephrasing your prompt in whatever particular way that suits you. Let's hop on over to our SQL file here. Let's say that we wanted to create some models based on this. We could say use, hit the pound sign, point to our SQL file, and ask it to create the SQLese models. And here you could see that we got a lot of code back, and everything points to what was referenced in our SQL file in terms of the artists, the customers. You can see how it's defining it, employees. So all the data types seem to be matching as we expected to, as well as the primary keys. And it even did some associations for us. This is an incredible time saver, especially the better that you get at prompting Copilot. So let's say we wanted to move forward with this, okay? We like what we're seeing so far. I can ask Copilot to create a bash script to output the project structure. And let's see what it does for us. On my end, I'm using bash. Depending on your operating system, you might be using something else. And look at that. It created all the bash commands to get things going. So I can come over here and just click this to insert this into a terminal and then hit enter to run it. It says the project structure was created successfully. So let's see if I go to my folder, and towards the bottom here, Console Music. This was just created just now. We have our controllers, some middleware, and models. So this is just a start, but it's nice to know that Copilot could be used to generate a script that could create the basic project files just to get the ball going. Now, another area that's been ignored is how great Copilot is for creating documentation for your code, in addition to refactoring and then testing. Let's take a look. If we want to demonstrate documentation, refactoring, and testing, let's go ahead and bring up the inline chat here at the top of this document. We'll start off with documentation. When we hit the slash, you'll be prompted with 4 options. Doc, so that you can add documentation. Explain, to elaborate on your code, especially if it's from someone else and you're not really sure what's going on in the code. You could just highlight parts of it to get an explanation. If there's anything wrong with the code, you can ask Copilot to fix it. And then there's creating unit tests. So let's start off with doc. When I hit enter here, as you can see, it creates detailed comments, documentation for each of our functions, which is pretty cool. But let's say I wanted to add some emojis to it. and say with emojis for each function. Let's take a look, and there you go. It recreates it, and now it has emojis for each, which is pretty cool. Now let's say I wanted to refactor this code. If I highlight it and bring up the inline chat, I can ask Copilot to refactor to put all this into a module. And there you go. It updated our code so that we could reference it through a module here. And the last thing I'd like to demonstrate is creating unit tests. So once again, we can do this via the inline chat and specify tests. And when I hit enter, it'll create a new test file that you see here. We could accept. It has all these different conditions. And what's great is that you're not limited to just leaving your test file like this. You could ask it to use a particular framework or limit the amount of conditions that you want or be more specific. But it all depends on what you want done. Thanks so much for watching. I hope this video helped you discover some of the more powerful yet overlooked features of Copilot. If you found this video helpful, be sure to like and subscribe for more content like this. And let me know in the comments which feature you're excited to now start using that you've been overlooking. And don't forget to follow us on LinkedIn. I'll see you in the next one.